Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland, and we are here at the Okta World Headquarters in San Francisco with Okta CEO Todd McKinnon, and also joining us from Atlanta is Vijay Balasubramaniyan, CEO of Pindrop. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
You guys might not be familiar, and hopefully you are, with both Pindrop and Okta, but you guys are security-minded companies, and you approach things in different ways, honestly. And so this conversation, we want to focus on the trends you're seeing in security and how you guys are addressing them differently for your customers. And a lot of the focus is on the enterprise, so let's begin there. But I want to ask you guys, security seems to be on everyone's mind these days, but is it? And have people really found sort of God in the wake of some really horrible breaches? Vijay, what do you think about that?
All right. So, with a lot of these breaches, I think fundamentally what comes to the forefront is the fact that security is a constantly evolving thing, right? The perimeter is constantly changing. You had just your data center, now you have the entire cloud to worry about. You had individual devices that were purely used for personal reasons, now they're used for everything other than personal as well. And so the perimeter is constantly changing. What is defensible is constantly changing. The attackers themselves are constantly changing. So the fact is that each of these attackers have such a large area to attack you on, and they've increased the sophistication of their tools. And what's more is they're collaborating, and they're trying to get through to you through a variety of channels, be it the network, be it the call center. They're trying so many different things because they're motivated, they're well-funded, and they clearly have a target to go after. So it's a really hard battle, and this is the reason you find a lot of these breaches happening. A lot of new technologies, when they get introduced without security paradigms in place, they immediately break at the basic onslaught of a fraudster.
One of the things that we've seen, it's the people that are chief security officers or security professionals or even CIOs, their level of vigilance and their level of concern about this over the last 18 months is pretty consistent. What's clearly changed is the people above them. The CEOs, the board, they are all about security now. And I think a lot of it is just some of these high-profile vulnerabilities and attacks in the mainstream media.
Right.
You get the CEO of Sony's email on the public internet, and all of a sudden every CEO in the world is going, how's my security?
Right.
You get the CIO at Target that loses his job, all of a sudden every CIO is like, what's going on in my security? So the level of heightened awareness at the highest levels in the organization is different in the last year.
How do you move the dials or twist the dials between kind of like that heightened sense and urgency for security and then running a business? And so Todd, I know, Okta, you guys go in and your hope is that you make it easy for people to be secure, but there's always this kind of tension between, look, we got operations here and what security can do.
Yeah.
How has that conversation changed, if it has, and how do you guys approach that?
I think so. Along with the CEOs and board members and other people, higher people in the organization wanting to have the security conversation, it's changed for us that we are talking to people higher in the organization. So business leaders, CIOs, CEOs, board members are bringing us into conversations and deals more than's happened in the past. Our product has really two different value props. One is we make it easy for end users, and the other is we make it more secure. So maybe 2 years ago it was more we were being brought in because it made it easier. And now more often we're being brought in because it makes it more secure, often from higher people in the organization.
Right. Yeah, what we're also seeing is a globalization of the fraud function. As these organizations are growing bigger and bigger, you have multiple lines of business, multiple folks who have, who weigh in on the security state of the company. And now we're starting to see the emergence of pretty solid global organizations that have pretty significant powers on deciding what are the tools they use across these different lines of business. And that's an important thing, because if you don't have that, you can be completely secure on one side of things, and then the fraudsters will find that weakest link, right? And so the fundamental thing is, since these guys are expanding their scope, what we're finding is once we convince one line of business to use the solution, often within the next 6 months, we're finding that the entire enterprise buys an enterprise-wide license, which augurs well for security companies as well as the security posture for these companies.
let's talk about that then, how you convince lines of business or an entire company to take on this, what some people will view as an extra kind of step or hurdle or burden. I mean, how do you, or maybe that's not the right way, you don't have to convince them at all anymore, but once you do convince them, how do you make that behavior change or that shift so people do what they're supposed to do, and that at the end of the day, the security works how it's supposed to work?
I think it's an uphill battle to try to get, especially in the modern era of IT, to try to get users to do something that is inconvenient or out of band. I think that, and what we see in our customer base and the prospect base, that companies and IT departments that try to do that are not very successful. So the key is to find solutions that make it easier and make it more secure.
Right.
And it's not always, you have to look for the right solution, and you have to put some good design thinking into it a lot of times, but I think it's just with all the options people have and all the devices they can use outside of their corporate endorsed framework and all the applications, I think trying to put a step in there and just send a nice, well-written email out to say use it because it's better for you,
yeah.
It's just a losing battle. So you have to figure out a way to make it easier. Like a simple example is maybe you have it's more secure and maybe requires stronger authentication, but the information resource you get to when you go into an application is better. So it's somehow better than the alternative you would have if you did your own consumer application off to the side. So good IT departments and good companies, I think, are figuring out how to make the services attractive and more secure.
So if you follow this hygiene, if you follow these protocols, you get access to the full burrito, enchilada, however you want to say it.
Yeah, and it's a good enchilada. It's
right.
going to taste good. It's not going to be some crappy Mexican food that you're going to feel bad after you eat it.
Right.
Yeah,
it's your metaphor, not mine.
It's a good point, right? Making security. Oftentimes before, if you had something secure that was more secure, it was a pain to get in, right? Like that.
Right.
So making security more usable is really, really important. And we see this too, right? In our case, what we do is we protect call centers and the voice channel from fraud. The current state of the art is asking you a whole bunch of questions. So you call into a bank and they ask you what's your mother's maiden name, what's your date of birth. That takes a long while. If you have a technology that can substitute for that and very quickly identify that it's really you on the other end, you've just saved the customer a whole bunch of time, you've saved the organization a whole bunch of time, and you've made the entire experience wonderful. So there's that one part, right? Security paradigms that are more usable. The second part of it is actually training and doing this at a grassroots level, right? Like when you get an engineer to code something, right now one of the key criteria is how big of a scale of a system have you coded up, right? How performant is it? How scalable? Most people, when they talk about, okay, when we put this solution, it shouldn't break as soon as we have 100,000 users hitting the site, right? It's ingrained in everybody's mind that you need performant, scalable code. What we need to do is add to that, you need performant, scalable, and secure code, right? And that needs to happen at a grassroots level, either through training or through getting individuals who are more security minded.
Well, let's get into your sort of philosophies about usability and ease of use, and because you guys, you go after different markets, and you approach things in different ways. VJ Pindrop is like you say, voice recognition, and I want you to describe kind of where that goes more broadly. And then Okta, you guys have a sort of two-factor, single sign-on view of the world. But so Todd, talk to me about how you guys approach design and usability, and kind of where you would like to see it go as things progress.
The best example, so another, Vijay, your example of the call center and not being asked for your mother's maiden name 50 times is great. Another good example that's right in front of all of us is the fingerprint reader on the iPhone. I mean, they've turned on passcodes, and more people have their phones locked now than ever before because they made it easier.
Right.
You didn't have to type in that code, and now they have a fingerprint reader. I think that's a good inspiration, and we take inspiration from things like that, where it's like, hey, how can we make this easier for the end user while at the same time making it more secure? Mm-hmm. The other, when you think about that trade-off or the design challenge that goes behind making something more secure and more usable, a lot of times it comes down to alternatives or competition. And what's happening in the marketplace, Apple being a good example with the fingerprint reader, is that there's inspiration and competition where there never was before. It used to be that you would have a a crappy Windows application running on the client, and that was what you used, and you come hell or high water. Now that you have alternatives for other kind of applications, the applications your company's provided have to up their game, make it more usable. Same thing for security. Every website that does security well, every website that has a good design, your company systems have to match that, because those are alternative and there's inspiration, and we try to take inspiration from all the companies that are setting these examples.
Vijay, yeah, you guys use voice and like you said, you secure call centers. What are you able to do with voice that perhaps we weren't even thinking about 5 years ago?
Right. So, even before, talking a little bit about what we do, it's just, what's happening in the world, right? Like, as the world is moving forward, the kinds of interfaces people are using is changing pretty rapidly. So, traditionally, I mean, you can see this at a place like CES where, you have the smartwatch, smart belt, smart ring, smart everything, right? And the reason they're smart is that they're able to understand what you're saying. They don't depend on existing interfaces like the keyboard, right? Imagine a Google Glass device outfitted with a keyboard that you had to type into. That would be a horrible future to be a part of, right? Instead, you speak to the device and it immediately determines what you want to do, right? So as these interfaces changes, there is the opportunity to define that security from the ground up. Mm-hmm. And this is a little bit of what we're spending our time on, right? Which is we're trying to make sure that when we see these voice interactions or these voice devices, we can add a layer of security, trust, and identity to that in order to make sure that that transaction is indeed coming from who it's coming from. And so we look at a variety of things, right? We look at your voice, we look at the device that you're coming from, and the fingerprint that's inbuilt into it through a variety of ways. We look at things that your voice is doing, emotion, duress, urgency. There's a whole bunch of these things. But ultimately, all of that goes towards the fact that we can do all of this in the background and ultimately leave the customer a great experience. You bark into your smart TV, say, I want to pay my AT&T bill. There's a bunch of companies that are going to figure out what you said and what to interpret it. Our role in that is to decide that it is indeed coming from you, because it might not be an AT&T bill that you're paying. It might be you trying to turn off your burglar alarm. Right. You want to know, is that Michael saying turn that burglar alarm off, or is it the fraudster has just broken through your window, right?
Right. Or even it sounds to me like you're heading in the direction, or I'm at home and there's some bad person standing next to me saying, tell the burglar alarm to turn off.
Yep.
And you might be able to sense that.
I mean, that is way out in the future, right? I mean, ultimately our goal is to provide that layer of security, trust, and identity. We want to be that platform that does that. So as these new exciting interfaces come out, right? Amazon rolled out Echo, Facebook bought Wit.ai to integrate all its messaging with voice. Google has Google Now on its Nest thermostats. Right. As these interfaces emerge, we think there's a great opportunity to essentially change the security battlefield by setting the right, paradigms in place.
Todd, how do you guys think about that expanding kind of world of things and data to secure? Should it all again kind of fall under one single sign-on kind of paradigm, or how do you guys think about it?
Okta is about building a system of record or a graph that connects together a logical connection of people, applications, devices, and organizations. And the idea is that once you have that system of record, then you can put the right policy on top of that group of connections based on the right context. So, for example, if you are logging into one application that's just an application that doesn't have very much sensitive information, you can do it from the road, from a public Wi-Fi. But if you're logging into a financial application, a more sensitive application for work, you must have strong authentication. You can only do it from certain networks. That's an example of context and policy. But you can only do that in a centralized, feasible manner if you have this system that Okta is, that actually has all those connections and knows which applications are sensitive, which users can get to which applications, which devices. So that's what it's about. So if you expand that out to not just phones and tablets and computers, but if you expand that out to any, the Nest thermostats or any kind of device that might exist on the Internet of Things. Our point of view on that is that those are all important, but they all relate back to a user some way.
It could be, for example, in the enterprise, it could be assets. It could be, you know, these 10 steam shovels, which don't exist anymore, but you get my point.
Maybe it's a museum of steam shovels, and that's what they display. But for us, it's all about, it's getting back to the person.
Right.
And ultimately, it's going to go back to a person. The person's going to want to consume the data or understand where that asset is. And that's why we think that having that logical map all the way back to the person is very valuable.
Speaking of people, it seems that most of the sort of high-profile hacks that we've been reading about and talking about of late, at the end of the day, there was a person or people who didn't do what they were supposed to do. There was all these warning signals and they were ignored. How do you help make people better at security and, maybe it's remove them from the equation, which seems like a tough thing, but how do you approach that?
Right. So I think, given the massiveness of organizations and the scale at which these organizations are growing, right? I mean, we see Slack, which has so many millions of users now and, has done that in the last 24 months. So as these organizations are growing, distributed geographically, have a variety of networks, I think you're always going to have people slipping up. You're always going to have networks breached. So I think that's a given, right? The one thing that CISOs as well as security folks within that organization have to figure out is what is it of importance that they're defending, and make sure that once someone gets on a network, they don't have access to the entire kingdom, right? So, I mean, if you look at Okta, right? Okta does network authentication to a certain level, and we do authentication on the call center. If you change, we keep getting worried about, breaches into the network, right? Someone got access to our network, but look at the call center, right? In order to get access to the call center, all a fraudster needs to do is pick up the phone and speak to a call center agent.
Right.
That tells you how easy it is. You should look at the network exactly like that. It's that simple. Getting access to the network or getting access to a person within an organization is really, really simple for a motivated fraudster. Once you make that assumption, you then start deciding within the system, how do you protect the keys to the kingdom, right?
Yeah, I think similarly to what Vijay was saying, I think that you have to be able to define the parlance in the security industry is least privilege, right? So you make sure you give every person least privilege possible. So no one has a bunch of privileges they don't need, so if they get compromised, they can't be used to take advantage of. The problem with least privileges is it's hard to do. It's much simpler to say, you know what, we have this firewall, we have this perimeter, and anything inside that's copacetic, we can bless it, anything out that is bad. But when you start breaking it apart and say, well, all the services are in my data center, people are roaming around, then it gets harder and trickier. So just the basics, making sure people only have access to what they should have access to, making sure that when people change functions, that gets updated. It's not a simple problem, but that's some of the basics of the access. If you look at a lot of these cases, these breaches, it was very basic things that were used or problems that were used to take advantage of these networks or these systems, and it was just simple stuff that wasn't cleaned up. It was the administrative access on a hardware monitoring system that had public internet access.
Right.
It was the employee that hadn't used their account and was used to log into when it should have been shut down a long time ago. So it's almost like the housekeeping of it all and making sure the least privilege access is the first step. Because I agree, you're never going to have perfect human compliance. It's just impossible. So if you just define really what is important, you have a way to put least privilege access, and then you have a way to actually, this is an important one, you have to put in systems to monitor and understand so you know when you've been breached. Just knowing you've been breached will allow you to react much quicker and minimize the damage. Some of these attacks, they've been breached for months and months and months.
Right.
They didn't know. They only found out because some contractor came in to do some work and said, hey, what's this massive log file that shows everything being exfiltrated off the network? So it's like, it should have been caught sooner than that.
Right, and something done about it, in which case, and in many cases, nothing has been done until the worst happens. Do you feel like customers and just, the enterprise at large has a sense that, look, the bad folks are already inside, or are they not there yet, or should they be there for that matter?
Yeah, I think whoever we talk to makes the assumption that they've been breached. They've been breached. they have to have great monitoring systems to understand the extent of the breach, what's going out, right? And then the second part of it is, deciding, what is important to defend, right? If you have a database of emails, of usernames and passwords, that's important. That's everything that you have about all your customers, and so you need to protect that very, very carefully. The only problem is, companies are growing this rapidly that they forget to stop and think about this. And I can talk about it from just personal experience, right? We're growing massively. How often do I get into a meeting where my engineers are saying, you know what, we need to be careful about the security of these boxes. When we roll out a VM with our software and, with calls, sensitive calls, we need to be careful about that. We do that very, very aggressively, but, I would want more of that to be done, right? When you're growing at the rate at which we're growing, it's always a question of functionality versus security. And you need to figure out a balance between making sure things are as secure as you add functionality.
What we see is that like earlier I was talking about the CEO, board level, and then CIO, Chief Security Officer. We see that the CIOs and the Chief Security Officers, they understand that they've likely been breached, and they're very into monitoring and so forth. Senior level people, more senior than that, CEOs, boards, their mindset is, we've never been breached. Well, we're not one of these 4 companies you've heard in the news in the last 6 months. We've never been breached.
Right.
How do we never be breached?
Right.
So a little bit is, the communication starts because those CEOs and boards are so interested, and now it's up to the CIO and the Chief Security Officers to have that conversation where they explain, hey, we're spending a couple $1 million on this monitoring service, but because we may have been breached, but we're not sure anything's been done. So it starts that conversation. I think it's healthy for the whole industry.
Well, and how do you shift that mindset from like, we've never been breached, to those people on the inside understanding that you probably have, to then setting policies and procedures that can kind of keep up? Vijay, you talk about how you're a fast-growing company, and there's new kind of scenarios every day. So Todd, if you're setting policy, how do those policies, and I'm just thinking about an approach that companies can use to be flexible enough and kind of reactive or foreseeing enough to build something or build a mindset that can account for what's going to come next?
I think the key is kind of like the government has, different levels of classified. Mm-hmm. They have super classified and like double super classified, and only the president can see it, and then they have things that are unclassified. I think companies need to have that kind of framework. Maybe not that formal, but they have to define what's super sensitive, lock that down in a way that's commensurate with the sensitivity of that information, and then think of it like concentric rings outside of that. The things that aren't as sensitive or classified, be more flexible, be faster. But at the end, if they get that risk-reward right, they can, I think, take the appropriate amount of focus and care for the super important things, the secret sauce, and for things that aren't as sensitive can be faster and more flexible and maybe take more risk.
Right.
Right. Yeah. I think the important thing is to not be reactive, but to be proactive about a lot of this, and to be, really clear about what you're defending. Like I remember this incident. We were going on to do a POC with this particular client. And just after we were well on our way to get the POC signed, and just after the target breach happened, that POC just got completely locked down. They said, we're not doing a POC because we don't want to give any data. And it was completely not sensitive data that they were working with, right? That's a knee-jerk reaction.
So they swung too far.
They swung too far, right? So it's like this wildly swinging pendulum that goes one way here, and when you're trying to do everything, what ends up happening is it seems so onerous that you're like, okay, we're not going to win this, we're not going to take care of it, and then you go all the way to the other extreme, saying, oh, we've spent so much time and we've got so little to show for that we're now going to change back to being an agile, functional company, and so you keep moving between these things, and the idea is to always find the right balance.
Are we going to win this, or is that even the right question to ask?
I think, so the way I think about it is, do companies and organizations take advantage of technology to make them more effective? So that's winning. I think that if you think about, winning is not zero breaches. I think winning is moving your organization forward. And that means, taking some risks in some areas, guarding things and being very slow in other areas, and figuring out the right way to do it. Another thing we haven't talked about, which is interesting, might be a whole other podcast, but it's the role regulation has in all this. we're talking about security and fraud, but there's another big question mark companies have, especially internationally, which what are the regs? What are the regulations?
Right.
And what do they mean? And are they even applicable? And that's a whole another variable when you think about what to lock down and what not to lock down.
Well, we are going to do another series of podcasts on regulation, I can tell you that. But yeah, like you say, disclosure, like who gets to know what and when, and what are the sort of liabilities and what are the requirements.
Because by the way, that drives as much board concern and CEO concern as security does.
Interesting. We will definitely revisit that as another topic. Vijay, what's winning?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the one thing is that the fraudsters are constantly changing, but the nice thing about what we have here is the platforms are constantly changing. So the battlefield is constantly changing, right? You have newer interfaces. So there is really a chance to build security up from the ground up, right? We keep forgetting to do this, and we keep calling it a cat and mouse game. It's really not a cat and mouse game, right? I mean, the fraudster is not a mouse, right? Like the cat and mouse game is traditionally that the mouse is so weak that the cat chases him, catches him, and then lets him go. That's really not the story, right? It's a cat and dog game. You're trying to catch the dog when you're a cat, right? And so it's a particularly hard thing. And by virtue of what we're seeing is more and more organizations are becoming more holistic in the way they look at things. Not only look at just the network, but look at call centers, look at it across, because the fraudsters are not saying, I'm only going to attack you on the network side. And then they're also doing collaboration, right? That's also really important, right? Once you collaborate with other organizations, what happens in one organization definitely affects you. We saw this in the entire Dropbox leak, right? Like everyone said Dropbox had been compromised, but what these fraudsters had done had figured out username, passwords at all these other breaches that actually worked on Dropbox. So you're no longer just one entity. So when I talked about line of business and being able to be cross-channel across these different lines of business, I believe that organizations should look across themselves and collaborate and contribute. And that's the only way you can get you can win. And winning is a relative term. It's, how do you manage to do all the things that you need to achieve in the next year or so without having, without giving away the keys to the kingdom.
You guys are building the future of security, and I just want to get a sense from you, and maybe it'll be invisible, right? Things will be secure, Internet of Things, all these devices we have will be secure without us knowing it. But what does that future start to look like from a user standpoint and from a CISO sitting in a large enterprise?
I was just thinking, just because there's been bank robberies forever, we never got rid of money, right? I think it just is part of the environment. I think the more we embrace technology, the more organizations will get value from it, the more they'll invest in it. There'll be some malicious attacks, and we'll have to deal with those, and it'll be kind of a constant thing. I mean, bank robberies never go away. They change, and we get better at them. That's kind of that'll be with us, I think, for a long time. I think that the security technology will get better. I think the fact that, in a somewhat of an ironic way, I think that the fact that the world is becoming more mobile and more cloud, you used the term earlier, Vijay, about attack surface and increased attack surface. That is true, but I also think we have a ton of more tools that we can use to secure the surface. I mean, the fact that we all have computers in our pocket now, in terms of authentication, a simple example, or a fingerprint reader in our pocket, gives us a tremendous tool to make things more secure, while at the same time giving a bigger attack surface. So because we have mobile apps, that are running on all these devices with tons of data. So I think it's kind of an evolutionary thing, and I think that. Again, when I talk to people a lot, I just say, listen, just don't lose the opportunity to embrace some of this new technology and move your organization forward because you were so scared and so risk averse for everything that you had to lock it down. I think that's, that is a real risk. I'm sure there are companies out there right now losing opportunities because they're locking things down.
Yeah, and they wish for the old days where it was all literally like, in servers locked into a room someplace and.
Yeah, we're not getting rid of money. We're not getting rid of credit cards. There's going to be fraud, but we've got to move forward.
Yeah. I think we have to just change the mindset that this is something that we need to do, right? There's no way we can not do it and somehow stay secure, right? So it's almost like breathing, right? Like the question is, can you stop breathing and still function well, right? You can't, right? You have to have security built in, and we have to start realizing that what we're considering breaches is also going to constantly change, right? With the millennials, the amount of stuff they post on Facebook and Twitter that would have been considered a breach, right? Like they voluntarily give all that information, right? My parents would consider that a breach of privacy, right?
It's a cartoon. Honey, you've been breached. No, I wasn't breached.
Yeah, it's they're giving that. So then the question is, once you have all this information out there, is that what an identity really is? If I compile all those pieces of information, does that make Michael Copeland? No, right? That's where the security companies decide, through authentication, more clever authentication, how do you determine that this is really Michael Copeland, right? It just can't be because of the fact that I know your mother's maiden name or I know when you were born, right? That clearly is not you.
I'm wondering why you know my mother's maiden name, because we met just today. So
Ancestry.com Ancestry.com is a great site. Okay. So,
well, Vijay, Todd, thank you guys so much.
This is great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we're definitely going to follow up and talk more about this, but we'll use your security tools too, and hopefully be more secure.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate the questions. They were very insightful. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.